Hello everyone, and welcome to the first video about mastering the edTPA. My name is Jeremy Delamarter, and I am the edTPA coordinator for the College of Education at Northwest University, and I am genuinely excited to be working with you now and sharing what I know about the edTPA to help you succeed. So we'll begin with video 1, which asks a very simple question. Why does the edTPA matter? That's a legitimate question. If any of your students ever ask you, why do we have to do this? And you can't answer it, that's a problem. Why do we have to do the edTPA? Well, the easy answer is because it's a state requirement, but there's a better answer than that. So what we're going to be doing over this series of videos is moving from the why do we have to do this, into the what is the edTPA? How is it structured? How's it scored? And then we get into how do we do this, right? Which is where we'll spend the bulk of our time. How do we actually do this? And we'll have video upon video about that. But what's very interesting is when you get into the thick of the how and you're student teaching and you're having to write this, it's very tempting and easy to become frustrated and disillusioned. And that's why I chose this particular graph, because I want you to circle back to the why. When you find yourself in the thick of it, in the how, bring yourself back to the why. We're going to answer that question at the end. Why the edTPA? And I think you're going to see why I want you to keep coming back to it, because it will keep you focused and it will keep you encouraged and motivated. So let's begin. Why do we have to do the edTPA? Well, in order to understand that, we have to start with a history of the edTPA. And if you really want to know how we got to this point where we are assessing teachers by doing the edTPA, we have to go back to 1957 to Sputnik. This was the height of the Cold War, and Americans everywhere were afraid that the Russians were about to take over. I grew up in the Cold War with the threat of nuclear annihilation hanging over my head. And we believed, wrongly I think, but we believed that Russia and the Soviet Union were godless people who were hell-bent on destroying everything we stood for. And so in 1957, when the Soviets launched Sputnik, they beat us into space. This was the first artificial satellite, man-made artificial satellite put into orbit. And it was about the size of a basketball, and it had those antennae, and it circled the Earth and went beep, beep, beep. And it was, to most Americans, a sign of the apocalypse. We were losing. How did this backwards, godless nation, again, I don't believe this, but this was the sentiment at the time, how did they, evil incarnate, possibly beat us? And so the fact that the Soviet Union beat us into space led to general panic and international comparison. We're falling behind. We're falling behind. The Russians are beating us. How could this be? We're a city on a hill, right? We are supposed to be the best nation on earth, and yet here we are in second place. And so this international comparison led to a series of tests. The first international math study and the first international science study were conducted in the mid-1960s. And this was the first time that American educational test scores were held up against international test scores. So these were countries like Japan and China and Russia and many European countries. And it's interesting, if you ever hear someone talk about, oh, America was number one, we've never been number one. There's never been a time in international test comparison that America has had the highest scores. It's never happened. But this testing didn't begin until the 1960s. So this first international math study and first international science study happened in the mid-60s, and then again, we did them in the early 80s, and that was called the Second International Math Study and Second International Science Study. And again, the purpose was to make sure that we weren't falling behind the rest of the world. And when we did these studies in the 1980s, we gathered the data, and the Reagan administration issued a report on the data. And you can see this is a picture of Ronald Reagan and his education commissioner holding a big picture of this report. And it was called A Nation at Risk. And then A Nation at Risk, the Reagan administration concluded that the United States was falling woefully behind the rest of the world. And there's a quote from A Nation at Risk, which I find fascinating, which is this: "If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to oppose upon America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, we have allowed this to happen to ourselves." The prevailing sense was that American education had fallen into such disrepair, and American students were so far behind the curve that it was as if we had been attacked by a foreign power, only this was our own fault. We had done it to ourselves. Well, as you can imagine, when this report was released, it led to, once again, general panic and international comparison. So what do you do when you're afraid that you're falling behind? Well, of course, you test. And so in 1995, we conducted the third International Math and Science Study. But this time we did something different, because now we had video technology that we did not have before. So where in the previous studies, we compared scores. In the third study, we compared scores, but we also recorded. We put cameras up in the classrooms of the high-performing countries, and we looked at what they did. And that gave us some very interesting data where we could begin to correlate specific educational practices with these scores. We'll look at those in just a minute. This third international math and science study led to a number of reforms in education that you might be familiar with. For example, No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, the educational policies under George W. Bush and Barack Obama, respectively, came directly out of A Nation at Risk and the studies that came after that. The national associations that teacher preparation is involved in, so NCATE and AACTE, these sort of larger governing bodies and accrediting bodies that teacher preparation programs are part of, all came around in this time. And then finally, in 1998, we had the Performance Assessment of California Teachers. We'll talk about that one in just a second. Right now, I want to go back to those videotaped lessons. Because if you remember, the third time we did this international comparison, we stopped and looked at what were the high-performing countries doing. We'd never done that before. And this is what we found. We found that high-performing countries spend way more time on conceptual understanding than they do on procedural fluency. They're more concerned in the high-performing countries about making sure that students actually understand the math and actually understand the science, not just that they can memorize the steps to do it. We also found out that U.S. teachers tend to shortcut conceptual understanding by promoting a rigid adherence to procedural fluency. I'm sure many of you have heard the stories of the child who solves the math problem correctly but doesn't do it the way the teacher wants them to, and so gets docked points. The student has conceptual understanding, but they didn't follow the procedure the teacher wanted them to, and lost points for it. This is exactly what they found in these comparisons, is that the teachers in high-performing countries were a little less concerned with how you did it and a little more concerned that you understand what you're doing, which of course enables you to do this in a number of ways. And what we learned from that is that student performance is primarily a function of teaching, not a function of curriculum. And in the past, when we had these international comparisons and tried to reform our education system, it had always been curricular reforms. Oh, we'll have different textbooks, or we'll have more structured lesson plans that come from on top. And what we had not done was, how are we teaching our teachers to teach? That question had not been asked, but that's what the data revealed in that third international math and science study. And this is where we get to the performance assessment of California teachers. Because once we learned this, California said, okay, if we're going to train teachers in our state, pre-service teachers, we should make sure that they actually know how to teach. Up to this point, all the testing, etc., had all been, do you know the curriculum? And so California said, we're going to reform teacher preparation. That was new. So California came up with the very first performance assessment for pre-service teachers, PACT, in 1998. Well, eventually, this Stanford got a hold of this. And Stanford created something called the Stanford Center for Assessment, Learning, and Equity. And in Stanford's hands, over time, PACT turned into a different teacher performance assessment, a TPA. Yes, that's right. The edTPA was developed by the Stanford Center for Assessment, Learning, and Equity. We call them SCALE. And it grew out of PACT. Well, eventually, SCALE said, this is really good. We think it works. We want to extend it beyond California. And so they began reaching out to other states saying, would you be willing to try this? Would you be willing to pilot it in your state? And Washington said, yes, we would. So Washington was early adopters. Very early on in the TPA process, Washington came on board and said, we're not ready to make it consequential, but we'd like to see what happens if we start doing this. And in 2013, all teacher preparation programs were required to be giving their students the edTPA. Now, the scores had not yet become consequential. You didn't have to pass it, but everybody had to do it. Because by 2013, the state was collecting statewide data on how is this working, where would we set a pass score, etc., etc. Fast forward 6-7 years and you get us to where we are today, where the TPA is required in order to become certified in Washington State, and we have set pass scores, etc. And as you can see from this picture, the TPA is now spread across the country and is being used in some way, shape, or form in over half of the country. Most states have adopted the edTPA, whether it's as an official state policy or is being piloted or being used maybe by specific preparation programs require it. And it's a very interesting phenomenon, this quasi-nationalization of teacher preparation. So why the edTPA? I want to tell you what I think are the takeaways of why we should do this, and I have 4 of them. And the first one is this. The edTPA aims to assess teacher performance, not teacher characteristics. In the past, when we've tried to assess teachers, it's all been sort of dispositional, and it's, are you the right kind of person, which is a very different assessment than do you have the right set of skills. So the TPA really focuses on teachers' skill. The edTPA is standardized and it's uniform. I showed you that picture of the United States, and it's true that in every single state that's using the edTPA, they're doing the same edTPA. And so we can compare and make large-scale comparisons. It's the same for every elementary math teacher across the country. It's the same for every elementary literacy teacher, or every SPED teacher, or every fine and performing arts teacher, or secondary history teacher. Now you see that asterisk. And that asterisk is there because Washington State has something a little bit different than anybody else. 99% of the edTPA is exactly the same, but there is one small difference for Washington State, and I will talk about that when we get to the next section of what. That's in a different video. The third reason that we do the edTPA is because by aligning with Common Core and in-task standards and National Board teacher certification, the edTPA aims to foster conceptual understanding of good teaching practices. It's not just about learning, oh, if I do this, then this will happen. It's learning the why. Why would I choose to do this in the first place? And Common Core and in-task and national boards and a number of other assessments that teachers go through, such as TPEP, which is Washington specific, they all are operating off of what we call the State 8, or the same DNA. They're all teaching the same basic concepts about effective and good instruction. Which leads me to my last and most important point. If you get thick into the edTPA and you're frustrated and you're trying to remember why do I have to do this? This is the point I want you to come back to. The edTPA can make you a better teacher. There are elements of it that are hoops to jump through or that feel that way, yes, and it is occasionally frustrating. But I firmly believe, and the data shows, and the background and the history of the edTPA all lead to this conclusion. The edTPA can make you a better teacher. If you take this process seriously, if you give it your best and your all, you will be a better teacher than you would have been otherwise. I believe that with every fiber of my being. I would have been a better first-year teacher if I had had to do this. The edTPA is the stuff of good teaching. Keep that in mind when you are halfway through the process and you feel like you are drowning in paperwork. This is building skills, and you are improving because you're doing this. So that's the end of video 1. Why do we do the edTPA? Because years and years and years of data has indicated this is the most effective way to reform schools, by teaching people to be better teachers. And the edTPA, for all of its quirks and some of its flaws, it actually does that.